Okay, Spike Cohen, you are the Libertarian Party VP candidate or nominee at this point, which congratulations on that.
Thank you very much.
Okay, give us, because I did an interview with Joe Jorgensen a couple of weeks back, and she was really gracious. She gave me a lot of time, extra time that I wasn't expecting. But give everybody your platform so everybody can get acquainted with you, because I will not interview Democrats and Republicans anymore. I've had my fill of them.
Sure, absolutely. So I am, like you said. I'm sorry. Real quick, this is just audio?
Yes, this is just audio.
Okay, all right. So I'll turn the video off, and I apologize because I had. Just give me 1 second. I apologize.
No big deal.
You can leave all this in if you want as a punishment for the fact that I wasn't more. Okay. All right. So yes. So hi everybody. Thanks for tuning in and listening. Like Nick said, my name is Spike Cohen. I am the Libertarian Party's Vice Presidential nominee. And for those who don't know me, I can tell you a little bit about myself. I am a business owner who started a web design company back in 1999 when I was a teenager. And 3 years ago, I retired from that company so that I could focus my life on my real passion, which is spreading the message of liberty to a public that often hasn't heard of our ideas. They often haven't heard of ideas like self-ownership and non-aggression and decentralization and voluntary communities and things like that. And so to that end, I became the host of My Fellow Americans, the co-host of the Muddy Waters of Freedom, and the co-owner of Muddy Waters Media. And we've been reaching millions of people with a message of liberty. And last December, I decided to parlay that into running for the Libertarian Party nomination for vice president. I went to college campuses, housing projects, countless Zoom calls, Skype calls, and everything else in between to spread the message of liberty wherever I could, as far and wide as I could. And on the strength of that, the delegates of the party chose to pick me as the nominee, and now I am the Libertarian Party vice presidential candidate alongside my running mate, Joe Jorgensen.
Oh, great. Here's the thing, though. I don't think that people haven't heard of the Libertarian Party's platform of liberty and all of that, because back when Ron Paul was running, he had a pretty expansive following, back in 2008 and 2012. But it just seems like in the interim, everybody seems to have forgotten it.
Very interesting thing. I think that within our circles, Ron Paul's reach was huge and, exponentially grew the movement. If you look at the greater body politic, most people still have no idea what libertarianism is. Never did. Right. May have heard the term, may not have. And I say this having gone to many different situations. I've gone, again, to different college campuses. The college students were the most likely to have at least heard of libertarianism. And unfortunately, most of them had a very bad take on it based on some misapprehensions about what we are and who we are and what we believe. But when I went to housing projects, marginalized communities, when I went to Republican and Democrat events to poach their supporters, a lot of them hadn't heard of us. Or if they did, they maybe had heard of Gary Johnson right. in the last election cycle. But a lot of them had never heard the term. I would say, have you heard of a libertarian? And they'd say, oh, a liberal? And I'd say, no, libertarian. And then I'd talk with them about what it is. But I think we sometimes don't realize that the vast majority of Americans have heard little to nothing about us. And the good news of that is that presents them with a blank canvas that we can paint with the knowledge of who we are.
Yeah, and I think that when people start hearing what the Libertarian Party platform is, I mean, if the Libertarian Party's platform, because you get on some of these websites, libertarians are arguing with each other about a lot of different stuff, the way they have their own viewpoints, which is fine because that's part of it, free expression.
Right.
But I think one of the biggest things the Libertarian Party, and I think Joe has mentioned this, is they really need to get a handle on the national debt, which is completely out of control at this point. And everybody thought that Donald Trump was going to stop spending and bring everything into, bring the national debt down so we wouldn't go bankrupt at some point, and he did exactly the opposite.
Oh, of course. Well, that's what happens. If you vote Republican, you're going to get more endless debt. It just is what it is. And the idea that you're going to get a different outcome from the people who created this system after over 150 years of their exclusive ownership of every single lever of power, at least at the federal level, and virtually all of the power, exclusive ownership of the power at the state and local level as well for the last 150 I think actually over 160 years. I think at this point we can be disabused of the notion that it's going to change under either of them, whether it's the national debt or the wars or taxation or endless putting people in cages for victimless crimes and so forth. None of this is going to end, and they're going to keep using the existence of these things as a way to get you to support this side over the other, or if not support that side, at least just not want that other side that's even worse to win. And I think at this point, we can safely say that there is no worse side or better side. They're both the same side. They just create this sort of rope-a-dope of making you think that they're opposing each other, when in reality they are in lockstep with each other on every major subject. Specific to the national debt, I mean, let's look at what caused that. We have a situation where the federal government realized that the American people would never agree to have their taxes increased to pay for the American military-industrial complex, or the police-to-prison complex, or the perverting of the 13th Amendment that basically just took chattel slavery out of the hands of the private sector and handed it to the government, so that we now have an endless number of people in cages doing free labor to the benefit of for-profit prison labor contractors and the state prison boards that get the kickbacks for doing that. That is a system that we would have never agreed to be taxed for. So they figured out when they created the Federal Reserve that they could simply have the Federal Reserve print out endless streams of trillions of Federal Reserve notes and lend them to the government in the form of buying treasury bills, and leaving us with that debt, leaving us with the bill from those, leaving us with the debt from those bills, with interest that we and our children and their children have to pay off. And even worse, in the meantime, by printing out endless streams of money without creating any additional value and inflating the overall money supply, causes all of our Federal Reserve notes that we have in our pockets and in our wallets and under our bed and in our bank account, wherever we hold money, causes it to lose value over time and causes the cost of living to consistently go up, which is why the cost of living continues to outstrip wage and income increases, especially for the lower income levels. And it's by design. It's intended to not only saddle you with debt that you'll never be able to pay off, but also to saddle you with a cost of living that you couldn't possibly afford yourself, so that you become dependent on that same system that was created to put you in the situation where you are. And that's what government does. They show up to someone, they beat them up, they take them, they take all of their money, or they take quite a bit of their money. They give them back a couple crumbs of it, and they say, "Hey, if it wasn't for us, you wouldn't have these crumbs." And it's a cynical, terrible shell game that has destroyed countless lives and done immeasurable harm. And it will not end until we get the Republicans and Democrats out of power.
Yeah, I had a discussion last week with somebody who actually worked at the Pentagon, and they were talking about the national debt versus our GDP. And the other guy that he was talking to said, "I'm not worried about the national debt because we have a GDP that's big enough to absorb the national debt." And I was just kind of like, okay, well, what happens when we don't? What happens when the national debt exceeds our gross domestic product? We're gonna find ourselves facing the same situation that Soviet Russia did.
Well, and the answer to that is once it reaches a point where it's pretty clear that we're not going to be able to pay that debt, that's when it's going to be a lot harder to get more debt, and that's when the interest rates are going to have to go up. Unless, of course, your only client, the only person taking these debt out in your name, is the federal government. So now you don't have to, or I'm sorry, the Federal Reserve. So now, because the Federal Reserve is basically a political organization whose purpose is to lend money to the federal government, because a lot of people, they talk about we need to stop where China is lending us money and Japan is lending us money. That stopped a long time ago. It is now increasingly just the Federal Reserve printing out endless reams of money and immediately lending it to the federal government. And so that can go on in perpetuity and lead to the kind of massive hyperinflation that we've seen in places like Venezuela, like Greece, like what are some other places that have had it? Zimbabwe, places the Weimar Republic of Germany.
Yeah.
All of these were examples where they just started printing out endless streams of money to pay off their political concerns that they could have never gotten the American people or their taxpayers to pay directly in the form of taxation. And what an insidious way of robbing us, to rob us from behind our backs, tell us that we have a debt that we have to pay even though we never agreed to such a thing, and also that they made our money that much less valuable in the meantime. And it's a bad system. It's why we need to audit and end the Fed and transition to a free market system of currency and away from a government system of currency, because not only does that end the reckless debt spending and running up reckless debt, but it also causes for there to be competing providers who will compete to give you the most valuable and stable currency so that your money doesn't lose value over time. It might actually gain value over time by taking it out of the hands of government and its politicians and cronies and putting it in the hands of people who would have a vested interest in giving you the best value for for your currency.
Yeah, and I don't think a lot of people really understand the damage that was done in the Weimar Republic. The workers there were actually demanding to be paid by the hour, because in an hour that money would be worth less and they wouldn't be able to buy anything. And look at Zimbabwe. I went to a swap meet where I could buy a $10 trillion bill for like $5.
Yep. And mostly as a novelty. It's not that it was worth $5. It was just the novelty of having a $10 trillion bill.
Exactly.
Its actual value was probably fractions of a penny.
Exactly. And what concerns me is that's what we're looking at here. If we don't stop government spending all of our money, and wasting it. I mean, look at that bailout bill that Donald Trump signed. The 2.2, somewhere between 2.2 and $6 trillion. And, for everybody get $1,200, and the government, we're supposed to be bowing and scraping and thanking the government for the $1,200. And meanwhile, they're handing money out like candy to everybody else who doesn't really need it.
Yeah, the $1,200 was I want to say it was $200 or $300 billion of that total $6 trillion that the Federal Reserve printed out at the behest of the federal government. Some of it they lent to the federal government, and the rest they just handed directly to Wall Street and big banks and the usual suspects for bailouts. And then the government, most of what they got, they also gave to airlines and hotels and large company chains, and also to Wall Street and big business. And so, basically under their continued universal basic income for billionaires program, they tell us that they can't, and we're not proponents of UBI, but we have UBI. We have UBI for really, really, really wealthy people. And the rest of us got $1,200 and told to stay home and only to go outside, to go to a big box retail store if we needed to, and then turn around and go right back home. You can't go to your small furniture store down the road. You can't go visit your family. You can't go to the beach. You can't go to the park. You can't go to the church, because that's dangerous.
Right.
But
you can go out in the street and riot.
Yeah, well, you and several other people can go to Costco or to Walmart or to Target or to buy stuff online on Amazon. That you can do, and you'll notice that the big businesses were absolutely never affected by this. Well, actually, they were affected very positively by having all of their competition shut down by order of law.
Yeah, and where in the Constitution did it say that they have the authority to do this? I mean, I can see an emergency if there was really an emergency, but even now there are, I call them petty dictators all over the country that are still pushing the lockdowns on everybody.
Well, and we've got, I mean, the New York City government has suspended habeas corpus for the first time since the Civil War. During some of these peaceful protests against police brutality, they responded by brutalizing all the protesters. Of course, that's the best way to deal with that. And they locked up several tens of thousands of people. And they also locked up any bystanders, including the press, Uber drivers, people that had nothing to do with it. They were just going around, and if you were in front of them, they were arresting you with no charges and just detaining you indefinitely. Some of them are still being detained over a week later. Actually, I think over 2 weeks later now. No charge, no cause. They're being treated the same as the Gitmo detainees, and not even being told why. They aren't even sure why. They went to a judge and said that they had arrested so many people that they couldn't even process why they had been arrested. And the judge's response to this, instead of, hey, you're violating habeas corpus, let all those people go, is they said, well, with this pandemic and with the protests and with everything that's going on, it would be unreasonable to expect you to process all the people that you detained against their will. So I guess you'll just process them as soon as you can. And so the entire writ of habeas corpus was suspended essentially in New York City, in the largest city in the country, with a bullet. And anyone who thinks that isn't going to filter its way down to the smaller cities and eventually to our hometown cities, whenever the government decides they just want to lock everyone up who's not cooperating with them in that moment, or is even just present during a time of non-cooperation, I think they need to look at the history of how stuff works. It starts with the biggest police states and biggest cities in our country, and then eventually works its way down to everyone else. And it's very, very, it's a terrible thing, and it is a perversion of what the intention was in the Constitution. And the only way that it's going to end is to get libertarians in who will end these programs and who will end things like civil asset forfeiture, where the government just steals from people without trial. And then if the people are found not guilty, they have to sue for their own money back. Ending qualified immunity, where basically the police can show up to a lawsuit for wrongful death or for abusing someone's civil rights, and they can say, well, Your Honor, I thought what I did was reasonable, and the judge throws it out. That's what qualified immunity is. We would end that. We would end the war on drugs, where people are put in cages and have their lives ruined with that felony mark on them for the rest of their life, and not being allowed to leave their state because they engaged in victimless commerce without the right licensing. We have states where selling marijuana was deemed to be an essential business, and yet in those same states, there are people that are in prison for selling marijuana because they couldn't afford to do it the legal way, or they did it before it became legal. And yet they still are sitting there rotting in a cage where they are almost assuredly going to get COVID-19, as well as deal with rape and higher levels of suicide and abuse and murder and everything else, all the terrible things that happen in prison. Their lives ruined because they sold something that the government wanted to be left to Big Pharma.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that I remember in California. Everybody was all jumping for joy when Kamala Harris was running for president, and completely ignored the fact she was one of the people putting people in jail for marijuana crimes and burying
she's one of the worst,
exculpatory evidence
on capital murder cases. So she illegally withheld evidence that would have or did end up exonerating the defendant illegally after the judge ordered her to release it, because she knew that it would result in that person being let go and not eventually executed. Now imagine the mindset of someone who would break the law and violate a judge's order to release something because it might result in that, or because it would result in that person not being wrongfully executed. That's who is more than likely going to be Joe Biden's running mate.
Right. And unfortunately, in our justice system, that's how they judge themselves. They want to rack up as many convictions as possible so they can sit there and use it on their resume.
Yep, exactly.
But I mean, and then if anybody thinks that the Republican Party is going to bail them out of that situation, when I was living in California, we had a pretty decent guy named Tim Donnelly running for governor against Jerry Brown. And the Republican Party went out of their way to sabotage his campaign by putting Neil Kashkari in as their candidate. Of course, they say they're not getting involved in primaries, but of course they did.
Of course they did.
Yep. And if nobody knows who Neil Kashkari is, just remember $700 billion in bank bailouts in 2008. He was the guy. And he got his reward. He got to be president of the Missouri Federal Reserve Bank. But I think I did mention this, asked this of Joe when she was on the interview a couple weeks back, is if say you and Joe get elected to the Oval Office, okay, what's the plan to start actually dismantling some of these laws and some of these entrenched alphabet agencies? I mean, I know Donald Trump said he was going to go in and do it, and look where we are.
Exactly. We have more than ever before. Exactly. Yeah. So the short answer is, actually, I'm not sure if this is a short answer, but it's what I start with anyway. The beauty of the fact that Congress has been increasingly abdicating their responsibility and simply delegating all of their legislative powers to these regulatory agencies that they create every few years, leaving them to just basically oversee the regulatory agencies rather than actually legislate, and leaving the power of de facto legislation to the regulatory bodies to just create endless regulations. That means that when Joe comes into office, she'll be able to just undo a lot of that before we even have to look at Congress. We don't even have to talk to them. There's so much stuff we can do just at the executive branch before we even have to talk to Congress. And of course, we'll be talking to Congress from day one, but there's so much that we can do right from the beginning. And for example, ending the war on drugs, we just deschedule all of them. Ending the war on guns, we just fire everyone in the ATF and decline to replace them and decline to enforce those laws, and to file writs with the Supreme Court to ask them to reconsider the constitutionality of those laws, and then also to put pressure on Congress to repeal those laws to begin with. With police brutality, we end the qualified immunity. We end the military. The 1033 military surplus program. We end the civil asset forfeiture program. These are all regulatory things that we can simply end participation in. And we can also use the Department of Justice as a department of real justice, which is what it was supposed to be. The Department of Justice was originally intended to find people who are violating the lives, rights, and property of the American people and to prosecute them. And at some point, it became the head organization for the military police state. And it's supposed to be just the opposite. So we would use the Department of Justice primarily to go after abusive police, government officials, abusive agencies and police departments, and abusive government agencies and everything else that have a history of abuse and negligence and discrimination. And we would go after those agencies and get some real justice for the American people. When it comes to education, we would remove a lot of the regulatory burdens that are adding an increasing number of administrators and bureaucrats in between where the decisions for education really belong, which is the parents and the teachers. And we would do this on everything. We do it on healthcare. We'd remove the regulatory burdens that are in Medicare and Medicaid, and the insurance burdens under the mandates through ACA and other laws that contribute to as much as 75% of the cost of healthcare in this country, and to remove ridiculous patent protections that allow pharmaceutical companies to jack up their price 10 and 20-fold on drugs that have been around for decades, drugs that at this point should have been generics before either of us were even alive, to get rid of regulations that don't allow us to go across national borders to import drugs that are perfectly legal here, prescription drugs and things like that. There are so many things we can do at the executive level before we even have to look at the legislative. Now, we'll also be drawing a line in the sand and using our bully pulpit to draw that line in the sand and put on one side of the line us and those of us who are helping to remove the boot from the neck of the people, and on the other side, the people who are working to keep that boot on the neck of the people and to allow continued needless, unnecessary harm for no other reason than men to preserve their own wealth and influence. But in the meantime, there's just so much we can do at the executive level that would probably fill easily the first 100 days, possibly even the first year or so.
It sounds like a plan. But
oh, and ending the wars. So we can end the wars without any because Congress and the authorization of use of military force that they keep renewing, they leave it completely in the hands of the White House whether the wars need to be continued or not. Joe can simply declare them to be over, bring the troops home, and allow the healing to begin from that.
Absolutely. And here's the thing that I'm concerned about, though, is the fact that there's going to be pushback. I mean, you've got to be expecting that.
Oh, of course.
When Ronald Reagan tried to get rid of the Department of Education, that went nowhere fast because there was too much money involved in it. And then when Donald Trump said he's going to get rid of the ACA, well, he got rid of the mandate, but the ACA is still there.
Exactly.
You know, so there's always going to be this huge fight between the White House and Congress when you try to remove that kind of regulation. So this is where it's going to get interesting, because how do you and Joe plan on, aside from just removing the regulatory part of it, but there's going to come a time when you're actually going to have to use Congress to get legislation done, and they're not going to want to cooperate.
Oh, of course. And here's the thing, and this is why the most important thing is to control the cultural conversation, because first of all, we're not, when we win the White House, it will happen as a result of our having changed and shifted the cultural conversation so much so that now people are talking the way we talk. People are talking about less government. They're talking about how the Democrats and Republicans created this problem, and how common sense libertarian solutions are the way forward. How Donald Trump and Joe Biden are knee deep in responsibility for all of the problems that we're facing right now in a very unique way for both of them. I mean, it's very hard to find two people who more personify every single action that has happened that has led to what we're going through now than Donald Trump and Joe Biden. I guess maybe Kamala Harris would be another one you could throw in there too. And so, in that situation where we've changed that cultural conversation, that means we weren't elected on some fluke where people elect us and then go, well, wait a second, what are they even all about? They know what we're all about. They know why we're there. They're not only electing us and probably electing other libertarians to Congress as well, but they're now putting pressure on all the other people in Congress to work with us. Because if we get the roughly 35, give or take, percent that we would need to be able to win a three-way race and get win the electoral college, give or take 35%, that will have meant that more than 10 times as many people that are currently talking about libertarianism are talking about libertarianism. That will mean that we will have made a major change to how people are talking about things. And the big government statists figured out a long time ago, it's less about who gets elected, and it's more about why they got elected. What did they promise? What are people demanding of them? And so, yes, we are fighting to get elected, not just for us in the White House, but for everyone else that's running up and down the ballot with the Libertarian Party. But we're also running to change the conversation, to affect the culture, to have our ideas reverberate throughout the greater body politic, so that people will want what our solutions are, and will pressure those who haven't already signed on to sign on. And so, now, will there still be pushback? There will absolutely be pushback. And that's when the bully pulpit comes into play. As people see the massive benefits that happen as a result of the executive actions that Joe is undertaking, and removing that burden as much as possible at the executive level, and ending the wars and freeing people and setting them free, and removing the criminal stains from their record and everything, the felony stains from their record and everything else, removing the burdens that are allowing for the militarization of the police and that are making it difficult for people to work their way up the economic ladder, the federal burdens at the executive level that that, made it nearly impossible for most entrepreneurs and small businesses to even afford to do business in the United States, and allowed the cronies to eliminate all of their disruptive upstart competitors, where they knew that they could simply move all of their jobs and base of operations over to China and other countries where they can develop relationships with dictatorial governments and use sweatshop slave labor, and then bring the products back over here after they've been made, causing massive amounts of not only the economic and labor and social harm that we know that comes from that, but also the environmental damage that comes from having all those things made on the other side of the planet and brought over here instead of just being made somewhere here or nearby. All of those things being removed, people seeing the benefits as a result of all those things being removed, will be an incredible headwind for us to be able to now push for Congress to continue moving forward with our agenda of setting this country free.
Yeah, and unfortunately, though, that's a tough conversation to have with people. I've been to rallies in Los Angeles and been to, on both sides of the aisle. And if you start talking about libertarian principles, they automatically try to label you as you're on the other side. I've been called every name in the book. Kool-Aid drinker was one of the big ones. When I wasn't promoting Republicans, I wasn't promoting Democrats, but either side, they are so locked into this belief system, the two-party system. And a lot of times trying to talk them out of it is pretty tough. I mean, the greatest time to get that message across, in my experience, was when Ron Paul came to LA and was campaigning there. The younger generations, they showed up. 10,000 of them showed up at UCLA, and they were receptive to the message. And again, for whatever reason, everybody seems to have forgotten it.
Yeah, and I think it takes all kinds. We're not the Borg. We're not going to absorb 100% of people. There are going to be some people who disagree with us philosophically, or people who just reject us outright, people who, assume that we're just trying to help the Republicans or just trying to help the Democrats, or people who just don't want to hear from anyone. But I think there are a few things there. One, there's a large number of people who are sick of voting Republican or Democrat. They're sick of all of them. They don't care. And that number continues to grow, especially with this pandemic that was caused by the CDC not allowing healthcare workers to do their job and test and treat and contain people back in the first few weeks that the virus was here, when that was still something that was achievable, and then using that as an excuse to start the lockdowns and tell everyone to stay home. The simmering over of tensions that have been going on for really over a century now, honestly, even past that, where communities of color and other marginalized communities have just watched the state increasingly just run roughshod over them and treat them like not even second-class citizens, but third-class citizens, so that they can herd them into prisons, and not just communities of color, but the poor, gender and sexual minorities, religious and ethnic minorities, immigrants, the homeless, and so forth. Put them in prisons, use them for free labor, throw them out when they're not useful anymore, and stamp them with a felony record so they can't get anywhere in life, so that they either end up back in prison or just living off the system. And because they have that felony record, they're unable to vote, so they've neutralized them as being able to stop them from doing this to people. An increasing number of people realize that they're never going to get good outcomes from Republicans and Democrats. And for those who don't realize that yet, I have found that it hasn't been too difficult to show them that. I've been to Black Lives Matters protests. I've talked with criminal defense attorneys and civil rights attorneys. I've talked with college students on college campuses, both online and offline. I've gone to housing projects and talked with people, excuse me, in some of the most marginalized communities. And I find that if you agree with people, if you meet people where they are, not just in their spaces, but from their precepts, and you agree with their fears, you agree with their concerns, you understand and empathize with where they are and what they want, you demonstrate that you care while simultaneously hearing what their concerns are, identifying their problems, then you can present the solutions. And they're not all going to accept it. And, as many as half of them might not accept it. But two things have happened there. One, you've at least planted a seed and they at least recognize that you are coming from a place of wanting to help them. Even if they don't agree with your outcome, your solutions or your outcomes or anything else, they at least recognize that you do care. And two, a bunch of people just saw that happen, whether it's in person at a protest or in person during a conversation or online on social media. People saw us being kind and empathetic and logical and making sense and demonstrating that we care and making good points and presenting common sense solutions to the problems that they face. So I'm a strong believer. We go out, we're happy warriors to evangelize the cause of liberty, and it does work. I'm a testament to that. I have brought in quite a few people, and using this method of doing so, it's something that I learned from, almost 20 years of leadership and communication skills that I learned from starting and growing and operating a successful business. It's the same thing in the business world as it is in politics. You go to where people are, you identify their concerns, you demonstrate yourself as someone that actually cares about what they have to say, you present that you're actually trustworthy and that you're empathetic and listening to what they have to say, and then you present your solutions. And we do that politically, and it works amazingly.
Yeah, I've had conversations with people, which it was actually really funny. With the Latino community in LA, you go there, you talk to them, and don't tell them who you are. Okay? And what you find out is that they agree with you quite a bit.
Yeah.
Until you say, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat, and then they slam the door in your face.
Of course.
There was an organization out there, it's still out there, called the Center for Self-Governance. And they went into one of the most depressed areas of Memphis, Tennessee. I believe it was Memphis. And they talked to the people about, you don't want to get these smart meters attached to your house. At least you don't want it to be done by government force.
Right.
And they did this outreach to the black community there and convinced them. Here's some white guys getting out there, going into the black community. Automatically, that's a strike against them. And they convinced them to show up at the town halls, and they had the government there had to not force that on everybody, which I thought was great. And that was a technique that I always think is awesome when you can talk to people. It's just, however, when you finally do in the conversation identify yourself, if the wall goes up and it's trying to tear that wall down, that's the hardest thing.
And that's why I can, this is the beauty of our movement, is that it is a grassroots movement. And grassroots movements are necessary because some conversions aren't something that I can do by saying some nice, flowery, well-articulated stuff on a podcast or an interview or a debate or anything else. I can get some people that way, some people that are on the fence or, aren't quite sure what to think. But there are some people that the only way they're going to be receptive towards our beliefs is by people who are at their, in their orbit that they already have some kind of a relationship with, who are willing to engage and start that conversation. And so that's why I say often, and people think I'm pandering, and I'm not. It's the grassroots people. It is you and the people on the grassroots level who are talking with individuals and small groups of people in your social orbit who are doing more long-term gain for this party than any national politician could do. You working together, as individuals working together to spread the message within your orbits, because it's a lot easier for me to convince someone that already knows I'm a good guy and that they can trust me and that, I'm a friend or whatever. Even if we disagree politically, it's easier for me to start that conversation again, provided that I am doing so in a kind and empathetic and patient and understanding and magnanimous and engaging way. Then I can do that. I can accomplish that. And there are going to be some people that it's going to take a while of them seeing that you're seriously about what you're about before they go, wow, okay, this might make sense. Not just that I agree with him on some subjects or agree with her on some subjects, but that their way of thinking on this is correct. And that, again, it requires us demonstrating that we care about the people that we're talking to and messaging to, and demonstrating that we hear what they have to say, that they can trust us, and that we have good solutions that make sense. Like you said, it's much easier to sell them on the idea, on the specific solution, than to now tie it to a name: libertarian, Republican, Democrat, conservative, progressive, liberal, whatever. it's a lot easier to sell them on something that just makes sense to them. Well, the beauty of libertarianism is it makes sense. It makes sense because it's the right way to do things. So really all we have to do is just develop those relationships. And over time, again, we're planting seeds. Those seeds eventually come to fruition. There are other people watching that are going to be even more easily changed to our side. And we just keep moving ahead and we stay, the happy warriors that we are for liberty.
Yeah, that was one of the great things about the Tea Party. When it first started, it was a grassroots movement.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it got co-opted by the Republican Party.
Exactly. Yeah.
Running around saying, we're the Tea Party. And all the original Tea Party people were like, wait a minute, what just happened? And
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's another issue. But yeah, getting the message out in some cases, yeah, you get the wall, you get the door slammed in your face. But then there's other times when I go to these meet and greets with some of my elected officials, and I go in there with the idea that I am not your friend. Okay, you work for me, you represent me in the government, whichever level that they're on. And so I hit them with some hard questions that other people come up to me afterwards and go, did you really ask him that? Or, that's very brave of you to ask. I said, no, that's what we're supposed to be doing.
That's what it's supposed to be. Yeah.
That's our job.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. And that is what we're supposed to be doing. Where these are people who presume the authority to take from us and tell us what to do as they see fit. We have to have some pushback there. And we can be civil about it and we can be, kind about it or whatever, but we have to be firm about it. We have to say, okay, you who stand up there and are, because you got elected or because you were appointed, you believe that you have the authority to do all these things to me. Here's why I think you shouldn't do that. And here's why I'm going to hold you accountable for your words and your actions and your promises. Otherwise, we don't have consent of the governed. If people are not engaging their government, if they're just going home and just kind of waiting for government to tell them whatever it is because they feel that defeated and they feel like government is not listening to them and never will listen to them to the extent that they don't even participate, we don't have consent of the governed. At that point, we just have people who have capitulated and given up and have basically had their spirit broken on the whole thing, and they just allow it to happen. But that's not consent. That's not a participatory system of government. That is a top-down, centrally planned, abusive, harmful, inequitable, and crony-friendly imposition on us by the Republicans and Democrats, and that relationship has to end.
Yeah, and we've seen that throughout history. Those kind of centrally planned governments never turn out so well after a period of time.
Oh, we're seeing it here. Yeah, I mean, there's not an example of a really good centrally planned government that has, served the people in perpetuity. The more centralized it becomes, the more decisions, day-to-day decisions that are being made by government instead of individuals that are voluntarily deciding for themselves, the worse the outcomes get. Because even if I had the best of intentions, it would be impossible for me to make as good of a decision for 350 million people that they could make for themselves. But I can only keep best of intentions for so long. Even if I am the perfect, I am the omni good person. I never do wrong, which of course there is no such thing. But even once I'm gone, now just some other politicians in play and using those same powers and not for good. And what happens is now, there's someone in there who is abusing those powers and who is really just using the power as they see fit because they have the power and they can use that power to stay in office and to put, their favored cronies in favorable positions for themselves and the cronies at our expense and run up endless debt in our names and make us all pay for it forever. And that is a major problem. We need true consent of the governed, and part of that means dismantling the systems that don't allow for people to hold officials accountable and require their consent before government can move forward on something.
Yeah, I've mentioned this to a couple of people before. I'm all for actually bringing back tarring and feathering with some of these politicians.
Yeah, and I originally thought tarring and feathering was like, like the molten tar from the tar flats or whatever. And I'm thinking, oh wow, so they would die and everything. It turned out actually most of the time it was just more of a major inconvenience for the politicians than an actual like deadly thing. But so I made me a little bit more agreeable to it. But I mean, I think we need to hold politicians accountable. And a big way, we talk about ending qualified immunity because that holds the police accountable. What a lot of us don't realize is that same qualified immunity is granted to government officials, including politicians. And so, for example, in Kentucky, there was a woman who, during these lockdowns where they also banned elective surgeries, there was a woman who needed heart surgery. She was 39 years old. She needed heart surgery. They couldn't schedule it because they had ruled that to be an elective surgery, and she died. Now, Governor Beshear, who is single-handedly responsible for that because he's the one that signed the orders, he can't be sued for that because he has qualified immunity. How much more or less likely do you think government officials would be to be so brazen with telling us what we can or can't do if they were held personally, financially responsible for the consequences of their actions, like anyone else would be?
And it wasn't just them telling us what to do. It was them telling us what to do and then going off and doing exactly what they told us not to do.
Yep.
So there was that huge hypocrisy that was involved in it as well. I mean, the mayor of Chicago,
Got the haircut. Yeah.
Yeah, everybody must stay home, but I'm going to go out and get a haircut, even though I locked down all the hair salons.
The governor of Michigan, Whitmer, she did something where she was making sure her husband's boat would be allowed to go out into the water weeks before anyone else.
Yeah, he actually demanded from the storage unit that his boat get put in the water.
Yeah. Yeah, but no, it's laws and restrictions for thee, but not for me. And that's how, I tell people, I say, these politicians, they live in anarchy. They live in a society where not only does no one tell them what to do, and I shouldn't even say anarchy because they don't have to actually provide value to their fellow man. They live in this perverted structure where they tell everyone else what to do and they rob everyone else to pay for it. They get to live however they want, and they create laws that keep them from being held accountable for it. And then if we dare say that something's wrong there, they do the typical Republican or Democrat thing. They go, well, you have to vote for me because I'm better than the Republican. And the Republican says, well, you have to vote for me because I'm better than the Democrats. And at this point, I believe we've reached a point where the majority of Americans realize that's not true. They are no better or worse. They're the same thing. They just talk differently to their respective bases to help further divide the population so that we're at each other's throats instead of stepping back and realizing that all these people have it out for us and have been working together in lockstep the entire time.
Yeah, it always reminds me of that episode of The Simpsons when the two space aliens were running for office. And when they finally got revealed to be space aliens, they're like, well, you have to vote for one of us. And, all the people got put into chains. And I think it was Marge Simpson turns around at Homer and says, she said something to him and he goes, hey, don't look at me. I voted for the other one. And it wouldn't have made any difference whatsoever.
Well, and there was one person who said in that thing who in the crowd who goes, hey, I'm going to, I don't have to do this. I'm going to vote third party. And they go, oh, sure, throw your vote away. And they start laughing and the crowd starts laughing. Not as much of that crowd is laughing anymore. An increasing number of people realize the only throwing your vote away is voting for the same schmucks who've been saying that they're going to fix this, who are the ones who've created and made the problem worse to begin with. So at this point, I think we can safely say that the only wasted vote is doubling down on the same bad ideas that got us here. It is not a wasted vote to vote for the only people saying that they're going to change this, that they're going to apply new common sense solutions to fix all of this.
But they're going to get it right this time. They promised.
Oh, I'm sure. They just need the right people in charge.
Yeah, and we'll talk about holding our elected officials accountable. Just look at Washington, D.C. it's like a microcosm of just a dog and pony show, time after time after time. Everybody's going to these hearings where everybody's yelling back and forth. I mean, we had the impeachment hearings. We had the Hillary Clinton sitting up there. We had Leon Panetta, which was one of the worst ones, getting grilled by Jeff Sessions. And they all acknowledge, yes, there has been wrong done here, but nothing ever happens.
Exactly.
Ever. I mean, they never put anybody. I mean, they'll throw somebody under the bus occasionally, but for the most part, they are a protected class here in the United States.
Yep, absolutely. Yep. No, it is a major problem. I actually, we need to wrap up in the next few minutes because I have another thing after this. But go ahead.
Yeah, I'm actually glad you even gave me this much time. So
okay, no problem.
It's pretty. I thank you for that.
Oh, absolutely. Of course.
Go ahead and, before we have to wrap it up, go ahead and give everybody your contact info, or, your websites, your Facebook page, and your Twitter, and all of that other stuff where they can find out more about you, Joe, and the Libertarian Party.
Sure. So my social media, my Twitter is @RealSpikeCohen. My Facebook, if you just search for Spike Cohen, you'll find me on Facebook, or you can go to facebook.com/literally Spike Cohen. If you look for Joe Jorgensen on any social media, you will find her. She's on all social media. And then also our website is joj2020.com. That's JOJ2020.com. You can fill out our contact form. You can fill out our volunteer form if you'd like to join the team. And if you're able, we would greatly appreciate any contribution that you can make. Just go to joj2020.com and press the donate button. And I thank everyone for their time.
No, thank you for coming on. It was great talking to you.
Absolutely. Thank you again.
Okay, man, have a good one.
You too. Thanks. Bye.
All right, bye.